Thank you for joining us, Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts in marketing. When you think about your brand's content, is it relatable, accessible? Do the stories build? Did you even consider humanizing that content with humor? Scott Dikkers is a founder of The Onion and a subject matter expert in comedy and content. He's also a keynote speaker at many of the Digital Summit marketing conferences where I met up with him. And on this episode, we'll peel back the layers to making good content with the right context, priming your audience to know what to expect, and with relatable content that's well executed and brilliantly funny. So let's listen to a founder of The Onion try to make me, the shark, cry with laughter on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. All right, Scott, thank you so much for being on A Shark's Perspective. Very excited to talk to you today and would like you to talk a little bit about your own career and your history with The Onion as the founder, and tell the audience a little bit more about The Onion.
Sure, my pleasure to be here, Kenneth. First of all, I'm not the founder of The Onion. I'm one of a group of people who got it started as a newspaper. And the two official founders, Tim and Chris, found me before the first issue of The Onion and wanted me involved because I was kind of a local comedy celebrity in Madison, Wisconsin, where they started it. And they just wanted some of that mojo for their new
comedy mecca.
Yeah. They were starting this new college humor publication, and I thought it was a great idea. I thought they were really sharp guys. And I was a cartoonist for the first couple of issues, and then I was kind of an uncredited editor, and then after a few months they sold it to me, and I was the owner, editor-in-chief for many years. So founder is a word that kind of works, but it's really not accurate if anybody really cares about the real history there. But yeah, so I've always wanted to be in comedy. I always wanted to do comedy, and I started by doing comic strips just because they're easy to get into. It's like cheap and doesn't take a big budget, and I was poor, so comics got me noticed by those guys and got me the opportunity to do The Onion. But my comedy career, my comic career was going great. I was making a full-time living doing my comic strip. I had a daily comic strip syndicated in a bunch of different newspapers, and I had a book that came out that was a New York Times bestseller, even though it was self-published and hand-delivered to bookstores, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. But it's actually not that impressive, because what I learned was you don't have to sell a lot of books to get on the New York Times bestseller list. Like, I peaked at number 9 or something. I just sold a few hundred books because apparently Americans don't read. So, they print the numbers in the millions of dollars for the weekend box office, and they print the numbers for millions of homes for Nielsen's. But notice on the New York Times bestseller list, there's no amounts. It's just numbers. 1, number 2. Because if they put the number of books sold, it would be embarrassing, because sometimes you only have to sell a few hundred to get on the list. But anyway, I was feeling really good about myself as an early 20s-something living in Madison, Wisconsin. And my comic strip was stick figures, so I had nothing but time. It took me a half a day to do a whole month's worth of strips. And so when Tim and Chris came to me with this idea of The Onion, I just jumped right in, and I loved it. And it was so fun to have this blank slate where you could just write anything, and you could distribute it free to people. It was wonderful. Because in those days, there was no internet, so this experience of just being able to create whatever you want and put it out in the world was not a thing. There were threshold guardians constantly. You had to get through agents and network executives. I mean, maybe you could do a cable access TV show was maybe the most you could do, but there was really no way to get out there. So people who were really creative and really ambitious and really wanted to get their stuff out there had to be really innovative. And so people would do street art, and they would do stickering, or they would go to college and meet people and get opportunities to work in entertainment from the bottom up, and spend years working to get any kind of paid job. And then Tim and Chris had this idea, well, we'll start a newspaper and we'll distribute it free on the street, which is such a great idea because it encompasses 2 different mediums. It's the printed medium and it's street art, because when you distribute The Onion free on the street, and people walk into a bar or a coffee shop where they distribute free newspapers, they're not expecting humor. So it's almost like a street punk, which is wonderful. It's the best medium, in my opinion, the most satisfying. Bill Murray has figured that out because he works almost exclusively in that medium now, where he'll like meet people on the street and just wow them
Right.
for a second and then disappear, and it's like their greatest entertainment experience of their life. And so it was fun to harness that in the early years. But yeah, so the Onion grew slowly but surely over many, many years. We worked in obscurity for almost a decade before anyone knew what we were doing. And in that time, we learned how to write better and how to write funnier. I mean, sure, those early issues were pretty crappy, but that whole Malcolm Gladwell theory of the 10,000 hours was definitely put into practice with us. And by the time the internet came around in the mid to late 90s, we were the first humor website online.
Wow.
And we had already put in our hours, so we were pretty good at it. And so when we debuted, I think people were kind of surprised, like, where did this really quality humor publication come from out of nowhere? And they didn't realize we'd been doing it for 10 years prior. But that's the short story, from my history with The Onion.
So who were the comedians that inspired you? I mean, there could not have been a lot. You can be a class clown in Madison, but it wasn't exactly like it was the hot, the hot spot for all the comedians.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I often believe that the comedians who inspire me the most and the comedy writers who inspire me the most are the ones who are terrible. Because I see their terrible work and it's getting distributed and it's making money, and I'm thinking, well, I could do better than that.
Right.
And so I saw a lot of that. That's why one of the reasons why I like doing comic strips, because I think virtually all comic strips are terrible and just unfunny and predictable and hokey and hacky. And so I wanted to do a fresh, original comic strip that kind of broke all the rules. And I did really well with that. And so when we did The Onion, I had the same philosophy. It was like, well, I was big on Mad Magazine. I wasn't ever really a fan of the National Lampoon because I think I was too young for it. But I had seen old issues, and I appreciated what Mad Magazine and National Lampoon did. I appreciated that they did parody really well and that they were doing professional caliber humor, but it never made me laugh out loud. It was never gut-busting. And so I wanted to push it with The Onion and make it something that was just as clever and just as funny, just as skilled, but that you would actually laugh out loud reading it. And that took many years to figure out. So I was inspired by them, like the worst of them I was inspired by. But then as the years have gone on, I've certainly figured out that there were some people in comedy who were good, who did inspire me. Steve Martin and Woody Allen wrote comedy books, and I thought they were terrible. Woody Allen's were okay. His story structure is amazing, but his jokes were kind of like Borscht Belt. Steve Martin's books were terrible. They just weren't funny, and I thought his stand-up was amazing.
Stand-up was amazing.
But I just felt like there was a big gap in written comedy. And the only thing going was maybe the Harvard Lampoon. Spy Magazine had started in the mid-'80s, and they were genius. Absolute genius. But The Onion was doing something very different. So I was inspired by all that bad writing to do good writing. But some of the good comedians I was inspired by were definitely Steve Martin, who was experimenting with different types of humor that other stand-ups weren't using. He was using anti-humor and meta-humor and layering different types of humor on top of each other in such interesting and clever ways, and yet still making it completely accessible to a really broad audience. That fascinated me, because a lot of people sometimes think that you have to be dumbed down and you have to do really lowbrow stuff to appeal to a wide audience, but it's not true. He proved that. A show like The Simpsons proves that. I think The Onion proves that you can hit all the layers, and you can hit the stupid people and give them their burp jokes or whatever, but you can also hit the really smart people by throwing in a Silas Marner joke once in a while, and if you mix those things together, a guy who burps and then makes a Silas Marner comment, you've kind of hit all the bases. And so, yeah, Steve Martin was big.
Can you imagine having done King Tut today? How that would not play?
Yeah, no, and that's the other thing about back then, was that it was a much smaller field. And so you could kind of waltz in and own it. And granted, he did the work. Like, he put in so many years of study to figure out how to be a great comedian. And in performance, as you probably know, like, it's not about the material, it's about the confidence that you have when you deliver it. So he was a consummate professional on stage, so he could go up there and do anything, and it would be the funniest thing in the world. It's just how it works. It's a strange medium that way. Another one is David Letterman, who at the time he started with his show, I saw him as kind of a poor man's Steve Martin. But as his show got its footing, I found out that this was a really remarkable comic mind who was incredibly sarcastic about everything, didn't take anything seriously. And he was doing the same thing Steve Martin was doing, and Steve Martin obviously came on his show a lot and did these great bits, but he was doing the same layered comedy. And I think David Letterman really changed the culture of comedy in the 80s from what it was in the 50s and 60s, which, with the exception of the National Lampoon, was, you know, pretty old school Borscht Belt gag type comedy. And he turned it into this thing where it was like this pervasive comedy attitude about everything, where nothing was taken seriously. And that was pretty seismic for me. Andy Kaufman was another big influence on me. I had tickets to go see him in Minneapolis, but he got injured by Jerry Lawler and had to cancel the show on the David Letterman show. Actually, no, he was injured in the wrestling ring, and then he got slapped on the David Letterman show. But I'm trying to think of any others. I think that's it. That's pretty much it.
Well, so when you think about the brilliance of The Onion, a lot of it relies back to the content. And outside of the comedic part of it, you know, that brilliant shows and where the cream rises to the top. And what, in your opinion, makes good content good?
Well, it's a big question, and I wrote a whole book to answer it. It's called How to Write Funny. And all my recipes and my scientific formulas and everything are in that book. But I will try to summarize them for you. So, good content is first and foremost based on a good concept. So often people have a crappy concept that's just not interesting, it doesn't grab you, it doesn't do anything. And they put all their work into executing this bad concept, and it may be very skillful, but it's just never going to work. The concept has to be gold. So you got to start with a good concept. How do you start with a good concept? Well, you come up with 100 concepts and you pick the best one. That's the only way to do it. Quantity is the key to quality. And most people don't do that. They come up with one idea and they think it's pretty good, and they're like, oh, I've got my idea, it's great, I'm going to go with it. No, you're not done. You got to write 99 more ideas. Then you'll find your best idea. That's just how it works. Every comedian knows that. Once you have a good concept, the way you execute it is really important. You have to make it accessible. Everybody has to get it, and you can't leave anybody out. You have to use those layers of humor like I talked about with Steve Martin and David Letterman. And I lay those out in my book. There are 11 different kinds of humor. And a good humorist or comedian or good humorous content or funny content is going to make use of all of them, because everybody has a different sense of humor and everybody likes different kinds of humor. And if you just use one type, for example, like the National Lampoon used primarily shock humor and parody. They were great at parody. And that was it. There are 9 others. And so one thing we always tried to do at The Onion was make sure we're using all of them. And before we went online, we would think about it in terms of the issue on the front page. What's the mix? We got a good parody story here. We got some misplaced focus here. We've got some irony down here. That's what you want, like a good mix of the types of humor, so it feels more well-rounded. There's enough for everybody. You want it to feel like a smorgasbord for people. So I'm talking about the general overall presentation of humor over time. But if you're talking about a specific story, or a specific product, that's a little trickier, because then again, it's based on concept. It's based on utilizing as many of those 11 funny filters, I call them, as possible, making it accessible, and then deciding what kind of structure you want to use. Do you want to structure it like a story, or do you want to structure it comedically? Comedic structure is simply escalating the joke to a button. It's like a sketch or a funny story. And it takes a lot of discipline to do that. Most people cannot do that. And it's one of the hardest things to do. To come up with your concept, know what your joke is, and then build on that joke with increasing hilarity until the end. And a good 30-second ad will do that. A bad one will not. A bad one will be all over the map, and you'll be like, what's going on? What's happening? People forget how simple humor is. But that doesn't mean it's a simple-minded thing to do. It's very difficult to drill down and get that simple humor communicated. Super disciplined is what it takes. I call it joke discipline. Know what your joke is and be disciplined and stay on that joke and build that joke. But then if you're doing story structure, that's going to grip people in a totally different way. Obviously, you need a really compelling, inciting incident. You need compelling characters. You need to have empathy for them. And there's all sorts of strategies for creating empathy in characters. And I've seen good ads in 30 seconds that do that, too. It's totally possible. There are 30-second ads that make me cry because the story is so powerful.
Right.
There was one, I remember this Hallmark commercial where I think it was a dad dancing with his daughter at her wedding. You cry in 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. And the acting was amazing. Like, everything came together. So they had good characters, great beginning, middle, and end story. But you have to know what you're doing. One of the things I always talk about is you have to know what joke you're telling, and you have to be sure your reader knows what joke you're telling, or in this case, your audience. So know if you're doing comedic structure or story structure. Know what funny filters you're using. Be clear on your concept. There's this great documentary about the making of the Dana Carvey show, which I had the pleasure of being involved with. They did some bits on the show where Stephen Colbert read Onion news headlines. They ended up cutting it from the show because after the first issue, and they did the Bill Clinton breastfeeding sketch. It was chaos, and they couldn't do anything. But Robert Smigel, who I've since come to know, told his writers on that show that same lesson, the importance of communicating what the joke is. Because Stephen Colbert and Steve Carell had this sketch where they were two waiters who were nauseated by the sounds of names of food. So they would come to the table and they would list the menu items and just get sick. And it wasn't working, and Smigel was like, guys, you have to tell the audience what the joke is. So at the beginning of the sketch, they put a big title on it that said, Waiters Who Are Nauseated by This Idea of Food. Spell it out. Make it simple. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the sketch is super funny. Now you know what the joke is. So that's an important lesson. And, I mean, in a nutshell, that's kind of it.
So for marketers who want to look at using comedy, why do you think comedy is a good idea for using in an advertisement or in a story? I mean, the Onion's branched out now, has the Onion Labs that does a lot of those content videos as well, and a lot of those sort of branded stories. And one of the things that I've always liked about looking at the Onion Labs, for example, is that a lot of marketers can't tell content stories in general. They sure as hell can't tell them from a comedic standpoint because they don't know how to what their true vision and message is, nor can they make that funny. Also, a lot of those messages need to be when that content is delivered in the right place. And that right place sometimes is on the onion.com or on your Facebook channel, which has 6 million followers or more. It's 6.5, I think. A gazillion Twitter followers, a gazillion followers on YouTube. And it's the right place for the right kind of content. So if you're a marketer considering using content, why is that a good idea?
So first of all, context is everything in comedy. We were talking off mic before about how, or were we off mic or were we on mic? I can't remember, about the importance of confidence in delivering material. That's context. And in print, you can't tell whether the writer is confident or not, but the equivalent of content is context. And the Onion creates a context. You know what world you're in. You're in this fake news world. So the audience is going to be primed. They're going to be ready for that type of humor, and it's going to work if it's done properly. But why use humor? I have a lot of thoughts on why use humor in a marketing message. Number one is humor humanizes us all. And it's one of the few things that humans have that animals don't share in some degree. Now, people say that dolphins laugh and chimps laugh, and maybe they do a little bit, but they're not coming up with jokes that the other dolphins and chimps are laughing at.
Right.
Humans do that. And it is a higher brain function. It is a hippocampus function that celebrates our humanity. And so brings people together. It binds people. When we're fearful and we're in our reptilian brains, we're not laughing. We're scared. We're reverting back to the, must be safe, must find shelter, must eat, whatever. But when we're laughing, we're safe, we're comfortable. All those lower needs are taken care of. And so we're in like a nice space. So that's a great context for a message if you want to persuade people.
Mm-hmm.
Another reason, now this, I'm going to get really into evolutionary psychology here, but one of the theories of humor is that the evolutionary basis of it is submission. So when you laugh at someone's joke, you're doing like a chimp does when it bares its teeth and like cowers in the face of an alpha because you find their intellect to be superior, because you've just said something that surprised them and delighted them in a certain way that made them laugh. And when you can make someone laugh, you've kind of seduced them in a way. You've won them over. In dating, sense of humor is always very top of the list of the qualities that people want in a partner. And that's why, because it makes you like the person. So if you can be funny and you can be good at it, you're likable. So you're connecting people, you're bonding people, you're likable. And third, you're associating your product or service with fun, with laughter.
Right.
What could be better? I mean, unless it's a super serious, cancer treatment or something.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't want laughter, but for most things, it's going to be...
Or if you're dating an accountant.
Then you're in trouble. But it's going to be a pretty effective strategy for most products.
So I met you at the Digital Summit series, and I know you get asked to speak at a lot of events, but why is it important for you to bring your message to marketing events like Digital Summit?
Yeah, so I love these events because I don't know anything about marketing.
Except building a big, massive brand.
I mean, I built a big, massive brand, but I never took a class in marketing. I don't know any of the terms. I never had a marketing budget, never spent a penny on marketing. I just was making it up as I went along, and we were doing the best we could. And it's really fun to tell that story and have professionals in marketing say, "Oh, I learned a lot from that." I'm like, wow, okay. That's just kind of cool. And also just on a personal level, for a long time I've wanted to get more comfortable with public speaking because I've always been a writer and I've always been very insular and never been public facing. But it was a goal of mine to learn to speak on stage, and I took kind of a crash course with a friend of mine to learn stand-up comedy at one point, and now I'm on the speaking circuit, and it's just sort of been a personal quest of mine to get good at that.
So if content is king, then you're the king of comedy. How's that for a line?
I'll take it.
So Scott, where do people find out more about you and follow you and your podcast and Twitter and everything else?
Yeah, so my Twitter is @ScottDikkers. Instagram is It's Scott Dikkers. They wouldn't give me Scott Dikkers somehow. I don't know. I'm the only one. I think there's actually one other guy in Maryland with that name. I have a humor site, blaffo.com, BLAFFO.com. My podcast is currently called the Comedy Insider Podcast, but I'm going to change the title to... this is like basic marketing and branding. It needs to be the same as my book, How to Write Funny. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to change it. Haven't done it yet. There's that. That's about it.
And then you'll come out with a second book.
Yeah, the second book is almost done. No, the podcast will always be How to Write Funny because that'll always be the first book in the series. The next book is How to Write Funnier.
Great.
The first book is How to Write Jokes because that's so important. The concept, like we were talking about. The second book is How to Write Longer Pieces. And then How to Write Funniest, the third book, is about how to leverage the power of a team to create humor that's greater than the sum of its parts. And then there's probably going to be a fourth book with like master tips. Mm-hmm. And I got a bunch of other books in the works, so I have too many books.
Well, thank you very, very much for being on A Shark's Perspective.
My pleasure, Kenneth.
So there was my conversation with Scott Dikkers, a founder of The Onion and a subject matter expert in comedy and content. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from that conversation. First, good content is first and foremost based on a concept. If your concept isn't good but executed well, then it still may fail. The concept has to be gold. Remember, too, that you have to come up with 100 concepts and pick the best one. Don't just come up with one idea and then zero in on just that one. It's the same with comics and with telling jokes. Second, context is everything in comedy. Is the audience primed? You have to know what joke you're telling, and you have to be sure that your audience knows what joke you're telling also. Good content should do the same for an audience, considering your brand. Whether they come to your website or see an ad somewhere, why should there be any difference in providing the right context for a customer? Third, humor humanizes us all and makes your good content even more relatable and memorable. Got a question? Please feel free to find me on LinkedIn or send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this show regarding another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. So laugh a little bit, have a great day, and join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.